What is worship? Why should I worship? How do I worship? Welcome to the Worship Project podcast with Ben, Dayne, Kira, and Ryan. If you have questions about worship, you've come to the right place.
Welcome everyone to episode 2 of the Worship Project podcast. We're so glad that you're joining us for this episode, which is the second in our series that we are recording. And if you missed our episode last time, we explored the big question of what is worship. And each of these videos, each of these episodes will, I think, build upon each other. So I do encourage you to go back and look at episode 1 if you haven't already, because we're changing gears and we're looking at the question of why. Okay, so what was worship was episode 1. This episode is focusing on the why. Why do we worship? And we were talking, actually I'll quickly introduce my colleagues that are here with me as well. We got Ben, who I've been calling Ryan on the odd occasion, but Ben, Ryan and Kira Lee, who are all with me as well. But Ben, we were talking just prior to recording around this background of worship that has to do with the ancient Near East and how the ancients used to worship. And I think it's a really good segue into our conversation now, looking at the why do we worship. So would you like to start off our conversation just now?
Okay, sure. Have you guys heard of any of the great origin stories that aren't in the Bible?
Like the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. So that's one of the famous ones. There's also I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong, the Atrahasis epic, which is another creation kind of origin story. And these stories are often focused around how gods come together, usually in conflict. And because that is what a lot of ancient people held on to, that kind of became this thing of connected to worship. Mm-hmm. So the way that they saw how the world was created and how those gods operated dictated to them what they needed to do. Now, I've got a little thing here. It's John Walton. He's an Old Testament scholar, and he writes a little bit about people in the ancient world, and I'll just read that quickly. It says, people in the ancient world believed that gods had made people as slave labourers because they were tired of growing their own food and taking care of their own needs. People cared for the gods, who lived an opulent, pampered lifestyle, including food, drink, clothing and housing, etc. And in turn, the gods took care of the people because they had vested interests to do so. Thus, here was a codependent relationship of mutual need. So this provides context for understanding temples and rituals and worship in the ancient world. However, John points out, Israel is called to a far different way of thinking, as Yahweh has no needs. And the thing that made me think about this is our secular culture that we have now kind of thinks that those ideas of gods fighting and conflict as being really primitive, and we've moved on from that. Like, we know better, like that's the vibe. And it's made me think, what impact does that have on worship today? So where the ancients have been now, have we gotten to a stage where, and Dayne, I'm happy for you to take over here, but have we gotten to a point where people aren't worshipping anymore because we've kind of moved on from that primitive idea of how the world came about through this crazy spiritual realm?
Yeah. So really, Ben, the ancients used to take for granted worship in whatever form it was, but now we've moved into this sort of postmodern, this post what's the word I'm looking for? This post Enlightenment era, where we do away with the superstition and we do away. So does that mean we've actually done away with worship? I don't know how. Is there this inherent need in us to worship something? Is that something that we're saying? So I mean, it'd be interesting to hear, Ryan, Kira Lee, what your thoughts are around that. Is, although we might not worship, and I put that in sort of, do we still worship even if we're not religious? What is?
When you started talking, I thought of the Romans and their way of worship, which there's the Pax Romana, which you had the Roman peace, but I didn't know there was this other Pax that the Romans believed, which is the Pax Deorum, and it's the peace of the gods, and the way that the Roman ancient world worked was that, look, the gods have their own space and they're pretty much happy to do their own thing, but everything is connected to them somehow. And so there was this kind of, there was a belief that the gods were there and you had to engage them. But they weren't invested and interested in your life. So it was a weird kind of a worship. It's not an intimate worship. But you do have to check some boxes. And whilst we don't quite believe in that, I do think the modern secular person definitely has their checklist of things that need to be done as they go through life to keep the peace, right? To keep life's peace. What are the things that I need to do? Have my job, have my super being paid, have the nice house, the Aussie dream, tick, tick, tick. And I think we have a kind of worship, but it doesn't look like, it's not quite the same language. It's not a like for like to the ancient ways, but I think there are still some forms that are being followed.
100%. If we think about worship as giving our attention to and responding to something, right? There's so many things where we look around and that's the case. Like, if you've ever been to, a concert, right? Especially like a Taylor Swift concert or something like that, right? Everyone's coming together. Why? Because they want to see Taylor Swift and they want to see her perform and they know all of her songs, right? And they, for that time, giving that attention to her. And in a way, it's somewhat responsive. Or think about, a footy game, right? And to be honest, I'm not much good in this area because I don't really understand it that much. But I know people go to stadiums and they cheer on their team. There's even songs for your team. And it's really interesting, right? It's still people giving their attention to and responding to things. Yeah.
So our worship in ancient times was we go to the temple because we want to live in this pax, in this peace, because somehow life intersects with a god or a goddess or something, and we've obviously moved away from that now at least in the West in our society, but there's still these embedded traditions and liturgies and things that we do to maintain peace in our own lives. And I think when we look at the Bible, and we touched on this in our last episode, but as humans, we're all created in the image of God, and that's just an anthropological fact. And I think what we touched on in our last episode is that because we're in the image of God, there's this inherent need for us to worship. Okay, and we, as we said in our last episode, that doesn't necessarily mean we sing songs about God, but what it does mean is there's this need for us to want to honor, for us to acknowledge, for us to esteem something. And constantly throughout the Bible, if people aren't worshiping God, they're worshiping idols. Like that is literally the main thing we see again and again and again and again. The law in Deuteronomy is constantly, do not mix with the nations. Why? Because they're going to introduce to you idols, because they're going to introduce to you foreign gods. And we see this, how that maps out when we go through the historical books, when we look at 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, Chronicles, etc. It's this idol worship that's constantly. So
in asking that question, why should I worship? It's almost like the default position of humans is to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And so here we are today. We're not worshipping little figurines or burning incense here in the West, but are we worshipping our football teams? Are we worshipping our pop stars? This is the question, right? So we kind of went on this train of thought, exploring this idea of are people still, regardless of their faith, are they still worshipping? And I think what the sense that I'm getting is that yes, we are all worshipping something. And so we've touched on a few of those things: football teams, pop stars, etc. But is there anything else that comes to your mind, even if you're reflecting on your own experience? What other things might we want to worship?
You talked about idolatry just before, and I think again that's one of the things that can be considered primitive. but we actually have idols in our modern context right now. Like it's very easy. Like, one of those, we have Australian Idol, for goodness sake, back in the day for the people where you'd go and compete to be a pop star. But there's other things that come into our place, like money or career, and how we put that up on a pedestal, and we look for our career to actually kind of meet the needs that really we need a deity to meet. And usually when we put our hope and trust in something like career, it falls short, or if it falls short, that just drives us to push even harder into it and to work even harder. And I think what ends up happening is, and for me, I think there's a distinct link to worship, because sacrifice is part of that. So in the ancient times, and we talked about through the Bible, sacrifice was a part of the worship process. But in our modern day, we still sacrifice now, and that's what makes me think we're actually worshipping some of these things. So it could be like money, it could be career, it could even be body image, that's you've got to look a certain way, and then we fall into this trap of once you get there, you're going to be all that. But the problem is no one ever gets there. No one has enough money. No one gets enough success. No one has enough power.
Yeah. Anything else to add there, Ryan or Kira? I think we've given a good overview in coming back to that question. Well, why do we worship? Well, because it's intrinsic to who we are as people. We can't not worship. we all worship something. The question is, to whom are you going to direct your worship? Because our definition of worship in our last episode was worship is about being intentionally aware of God and responding to God. But what we're saying now is, well, technically you could be aware of your pop star and respond to and that's so that's kind of what we're saying, right?
I think the challenge today is, like, I agree 100% of everything we've just been said. One of the things when you read the stories of scripture and you see the idolatry, like, oh my goodness, like, it's a stone, guys, like, it's a piece of wood. And I think what that posture has done is it's made it harder for us to translate and see what are my idols. Because we're not bowing down to a piece of stone or a bit of wood covered in gold. They still exist. And I think the challenge for us is to asking as much as anything else is, what am I? As you've all pointed out. So yeah, that's the tricky one, I think, particularly for the saints, because we don't think we have them. And asking God to help us with some introspection and just really go, okay, can you show me what the things in my life are right now that I'm,
And
go, Kira.
So I feel like it's important to say as well, it's not, we all need a job, right? Yes. So it's not wrong to work a job and to earn money. That's not wrong. It's not wrong to like music. It's not wrong to like a certain TV show. And so it's important to talk about, where does it actually cross the line? Yeah, where is that?
Yes.
So I suppose, Kira, what the problem with idol worship, one of the problems of idol worship, right, is that it directs us away from God, but it can also pervert things that are good. Like, it's good to have a career, right? It's good for us to do these things, but sin has a way of perverting what is good to make it evil, to make it work against us, for it to be destructive. And so I'm thinking of good things like going to church, or good things like religion in a sense, right? But can these things that are good be actually turned in some way to be an idol? I'm just wanting to open this up just to explore, because there's things that we do in church that are good. But they're good because they point us toward God, and they're good because they're trying to get us to interact and engage with God. But can just theoretically, hypothetically, could these good things themselves become idols?
You're listening to the Worship Project podcast.
I think that's a possibility. I think Brian might have something interesting to say about this as well, is I wonder whether somewhere beneath this is making an idol out of ourselves. And I'm not trying to take you away from your question, but I guess what I'm trying to think of is that sometimes the practices of our church, we can attach our identity to those. And so if we attach our identity, like say you're the worship leader, your identity can be tied to that, in that if you do a really good worship service, if you lead everyone, then that means that you're valuable and that what you bring and your importance rises up. Now, I think if that's where you end up, and that can happen in other things, like maybe someone says, you're great at prayer and they want you to lead prayer all the time. If you find your identity in prayer, then all of a sudden things are going to start going out of whack. And that's where I think it leads to what you're saying about these idols, because it's like, well, I have to be a good worship leader because that defines who I am. And so then you work at that, and you keep looking toward that. So you keep worshiping that in a way that it's like, I have to do that to feed this desire within me to feel good enough. And that, I would suggest, is missing. You've lost your identity in Christ when you do that.
Yeah. We've got a good thing like this role at church, which is a great thing because it connects others to God. But our sinful disposition wants to use that and turn it into an idol.
Yeah.
Ryan, you had something to share as well, I think?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this. I only came across this concept not too long ago, but it was very profound. In the scripture, there are these people who, from time to time, and they'll describe their actions as being, I was jealous for the Lord. And you see it all the time. And Paul describes himself, and I was a super Jew, I was jealous for the Lord, zealous for the Lord. You could use the words interchangeably. You see this in the life of Elijah, and I'll drill down on that in a moment. But that word comes from this story in the Old Testament where in the wilderness, the Israelites are heading to the promised land. But there's just this there's this leadership questioning. Should Moses be the leader? And Korah leads this rebellion, and then there's this zealous act where this priest comes and they just take all of those in rebellion. They take their lives. It's horrible. And there's this word now that gets attached to good spiritual behavior, being zealous for the Lord. Elijah on Mount Carmel, God shows up in fire, and then he goes and does this zealous act. I've done this spiritual thing. He goes to Mount Sinai a few days later. Things didn't pan out the way he hoped for. And when God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? He says, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, but everybody else has forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars. They've killed your prophets, and I'm the only one left. And you can see Elijah's heart. He's like, I've been doing all of this religious activity, and it's not got the results I thought it would. And God's kind of it's like Elijah has to say it, but it's almost like he has to hear what he's saying. Wow. Like, you thought all of these things were going to move me in a certain way, move the people in a certain way, 1 + 1 = 2. Like, what were you expecting here, Elijah? And he you can see that he has a formulaic approach to worship, and it just didn't work out the way he'd hoped. And I think in church we do that. There's these formulaic approaches, and some life's, it's got its ups and downs, but I was raised in a setting, I say this respectfully, if I pray the prayer, if I pray the blood of Jesus over my family, if I fast, if I do the Lord's Prayer, if I read my Bible for 1 hour a day, good things will happen. And that's just not true to life, right? The sun shines on all of us. The scripture says. So I think we need to wrestle with, sometimes we worship in this formulaic way, expecting now God must do all of these things. And, there we go. But it doesn't work out that way. So we need to wrestle with that a little bit more and appreciate that our worship did not control God the way we think it does.
So what I'm sort of hearing is that, okay, we've got this big question of why should we worship? And the reason why we should worship is because actually we all do worship something. So the question is not, should I worship? It's what you do worship. So who or what are you going to worship? And when we're not worshiping God, we're worshiping idols. Okay. And even some good things, some great things can become idols, because that's what sin does, right? It wants us it perverts what's good. And even we can adopt these sort of ritualistic practices, which are not intrinsically bad, are not intrinsically wrong, but it can sort of make a really sort of mechanic around, or formulas, I think was what you were saying, Ryan, around, we do this and we're going to get this output. So these are some of the things that we've explored. I don't know if there's anything else you want to throw in there at all, Kira, just around this idea of like, so what if I don't worship God? Like, is there anything else there that you feel like you'd like to add, or?
No, I like the point that's been made here, is that you're worshipping and giving your attention to something, whether you realize it or not. Yeah, exactly. And we live in an individualistic society where it's kind of like, what's in it for me? If I'm going to sign up to this worship thing, okay, maybe whether I like it or not, I have signed up to it. But if I want to sign up to the worshipping God thing, because actually, like if we're to be honest, if we're to be super, super real, in a Western society, there's a sense in which I can get up, work my job, raise my family, and everything's great. There's a sense in which we can do that. We have that luxury in our Western society. So if I've got my consumeristic, individualistic hat on, and I'm saying, Ben, Ryan, Kira, convince me, why should I worship? Or in other words, what's the benefit that I get from this? Because I want to know before I sign up to it. I wonder how we would explore and unpack that. Do we benefit from worship? Yeah, worship, it brings us to the transcendent, which is this higher realm. And I think that when we worship God, that leads us into awe. And we're actually wired to feel awe. There's actually a field of study, right? People who, seriously, there's been studies that have chronicled that people who go out and spend some time around some trees, some really big eucalyptus trees, when they come back from that, they're more likely to pick up a pen for somebody who's dropped it.
Wow.
Seriously, like being in awe makes us nicer people. And this is, it's interesting to think about. And so awe is actually good for us. And when we look to that, I think, we're wired for it. And I think one of the easiest ways to get that is that awe for God. Yeah.
Like, I know none of us here are scientists or anything like that, but I wonder if there is a link there around like this neuroplasticity, brain, conditioning the brain to, as we connect with God, does that translate? I don't know if you have anything to share around that, Ryan. No,
it's something that I've thought through a bit in my own life, just even on a personal level. Now I have kids, and I'm watching what they take in and how it like impacts who they are becoming. I can really easily just see from an observational perspective that my kids are becoming like the things they take in, for better or for worse. Does that mean I need to now like get the Bible in? I probably need to be more mindful about that. But yeah, I think there's a lot to say about that science is unpacking about the way our minds are shaped as we look at something. And so the question is, what are we looking? We've said already, we are all worshippers. But yeah, I think we've been designed on a fundamental level to look at God, like you said, something that's bigger, something that's awe-inspiring. And I'm not a scientist, but I believe that it's God's designed us to have some kind of impact on a deeper level. When we look at him or the things of God, maybe his creation, we read something inspiring in scripture, we have a moment with him, in quiet contemplation in prayer, it does something for the soul that just elevates us as people. And I see that in my own kids. It's crazy to sort of see it. I've got an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And I, you know, we're here to talk about worship, but I can see the moments where, you know, I drill down, okay, I really want to make family worship a priority and reflecting on what God's been doing, or that walk we took together. What did you see? What did you know? What does that tell you about God? It changes my kids. Maybe not instantly, but I can see that there's something going on inside of them. And I'm realizing, man, our world is not wired at the moment to lead us there. It really wants to pull us in another direction. And so as a parent now, I've been starting to stress, I'm like, man, what are those inputs in my kids' lives? And I dare say the majority of the things that are targeted at my kids are not designed to bring them into this awe and this like reverence. When I say reverence, but the person of God and how big he is. Our world is not wanting to take our children there, or us for that matter.
So worship has this therapeutic benefit,
yes,
for us as we engage in it, because we're connecting with this transcendent. But anything else you'd like to add on to that, Ben, in terms of how we as people might benefit?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different things that can contribute to that, and it's hard to drill down. If you'll indulge me just for a moment, as I was thinking about Ryan talking about neuroplasticity and how that impacts us in the way that we see God, there was a time in my life where I had this 45-minute commute or something like this, and I got in this habit that every morning of that commute I would listen to this preacher, and I'd found this preacher who was like super gospel centered and would always he was really good at looking at the secular world and seeing how that interrelates with God and Christianity. And so I was immersing myself in this every single morning. And this is where, for me, the neuroplasticity starts to come in. So I was like strengthening these pathways in my brain to think about life through a gospel lens. And then I found that there were things that were not part of my devotional learning time that I would start to see the gospel in. So sometimes that would be a pop song. And so I'd be listening to this pop song and, you know, the lyrics would like indicate, you know, if only I found the love of my life, everything would be sorted. But because I'd been strengthening these pathways from a godly perspective, in my head, I'm like, if you find that partner, well, you're never going to find that partner that's going to fully fulfill your desires. And I could listen to that secular song for whatever, but I could still see the inadequacy that would be, and that directed me back to God being the all-sufficient person that I needed. And I think I can definitely relate to that kind of thing of what I'm immersed in, that becomes what I'm become fluent in, and I start to see the world differently.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's excellent. So we actually get all these benefits from worship, if I can speak into that, because that's where our culture's at, right, is what benefits me. But if I can change gears ever so slightly and just put this question out there just as a bit of a teaser, like, is it right to say, or is it fair, is there any truth in saying God benefits from our worship? I just want to put that out there as a thought experiment. Does God benefit from our worship at all?
You're listening to the Worship Project podcast.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm just giving you space to think about that. What do you think, Ben?
Oh, look, my inclination is yes.
Okay. And
my inclination is yes when I think about it, because God has given me the capacity to do that. And because, just because God's given me the capacity doesn't make it good, I guess. Sorry, I've got to make sure I'm tracking well here. But there's something about being in relationship where you appreciate the other person. And so I believe God grew his family and made created beings to be in relationship and family with him. And at the moment, there's some brokenness in that family. But what we're looking towards is the reconnection of that. Now, to me, there must be something about how people connect with one another and how people connect with God that is beneficial to God. Because I think about if God is love, and we can talk about the Trinity, and the Trinity is something that's quite hard to grasp because we don't have adequate analogies in our physical realm to get our heads around that. But there's something about how God, the Father loves the Son, the Father loves the Spirit, but then the Jesus loves the Father and Spirit, and there's this coming back. So to me, I would like to say, well, does the Father benefit from the love of the Spirit, or does Jesus benefit from the love of Jesus? And if I take that kind of idea and I think, well, God's made me to image God, and so if I take that on, that makes me think, well, if the Trinity loves each other and there's benefit there, well, then why can't I, being made in the image of God, benefit God himself?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I love it.
This will come through more and more as we do these podcasts, but so much of, I guess, my growth in the area has been through becoming a father. It seems to always gravitate around that. If I was to frame this from the perspective of the relationship I have with my children, do I benefit from the little things that they do for me, like the little 2-year-old crayon drawing? I don't benefit from it. But man, do I want it? Yes. Oh yes, do I want it? And I want it from a sincere place. When my daughter comes home, she's like, Dad, my older boys are not doing that anymore. I've got one child left who's excited to see Dad when he gets home. She's always so excited, and she'll tell me what she's been doing, and she wants me to come and do life with her. I love it. And I kind of wonder, I'm like, does God feel that way? Like, does he need that? I don't think so, but does he want it from a genuine place? Yes. So if you ask this question, I was like yes and no. Like, it's a nuanced answer for me when I think of that.
But how much of a jerk would you be as the dad that your kid comes with that thing that they've poured their heart and soul in, and you're like, yeah, whatever, that means nothing to me. To me, that would be an absolute shameful part of your character to respond as a loving father that way. So I think that's where I go again with God and going, hang on a minute, I think God's character is so good that he would appreciate that in truth, not in a facade, not in a fake way of like, yeah, I'm pretending I like this. I think he would, as a father, I think you know what's behind it. You know the love that is there, that's within your child. And even though the gift that they've offered is somewhat meaningless, it's not meaningless because it's your child and it's a representation of their heart.
Dayne, I want to know what your thoughts. This was a very good question. I feel like there's something under there.
Yeah, look, I'll give my 2 cents, and I've got the benefit of being able to just reflect on what you're saying and kind of go, yeah, interesting. I wonder what I would say against that. And I actually want to go back to where we started within the context of the ancient world, because, and even in some Eastern religions in our society now, there's this sense that there's this teaching that, God is the tree, pantheism or panentheism, that God he's not separate or other than creation, but he is somehow embedded in creation. And so therefore there's this direct, God is directly impacted by precisely everything that we do. And we don't, as Christians, we don't affirm that because we're not pantheists, we're not panentheists. And my mind actually goes to when Paul is dialoguing with some of the philosophies of the ancient world or of the first century, where in Acts 17 in the Areopagus, which is this place in Athens, he actually explicitly tells us that the God who made the world and everything in it, and this is verse 24 in Acts 17, he's the Lord of heavens and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he is not served by human hands, right? And on and on it goes. But we're getting this sense that that God's not like these other little g gods who are part of this cosmos, but God is other, and God is outside this cosmos. So I think when we say, does God benefit, I think where we hesitate a little bit around that is because we're very, very careful to not say that we impact God in that pantheistic sense that God is. But on the other hand, we don't want to completely dismiss it, because actually the way God set up this creation with Adam and Eve, with their vocation, which we spoke about in our last episode, God set up this creation in such a way that his image bearers would serve this function of stewarding the praises of God to creation, but then reflecting the praises of creation back toward God. Adam and Eve are created as like the first priests, if you want to call it that. This priestly duty of being these intermediaries between the transcendent God and his creation. But of course, as we touched on in our episode, we terribly failed at that. And what creation has been yearning for is for God's image bearers to be reinstated so that all creation can receive and the blessings of God, and that God can, in this sense, receive the praises of creation. Not that God needs it, because I think there's two concepts here, right? God has this intrinsic glory that intrinsic to God's character is that he is sovereign, he's all knowing, he's all powerful. That just is, right? But I think the way God set up this world is that there's also this kind of ascribed glory. There's this glory that doesn't necessarily add to God's glory, but there's this glory that God wants to receive by virtue of the way that he set everything up. And I think this is what exactly happens with Jesus, is that Jesus pops up, and Jesus is the true human, the true image bearer. And Jesus is totally in this constant posture of worshipping God, and God delights in that. This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Why? Because Jesus is acting out that function that we all failed at.
Yeah, I love that.
And the good news, this is the gospel. The good news is that we now have the Holy Spirit who transforms us more and more into the image of Christ. Yeah. So that we can become true worshippers, so that we can be reinstated to that place where we were originally created to be. Okay, so in a sense, I would argue that this whole salvation journey that we're on is precisely to recover this vocation of worship, which is to the glory of God. And so at the end of the day, God just doesn't have his Son worshiping. God gets all creation ultimately, but us included, worshipping him. And you can't read Revelation and not come away with this sense that God gets glory at the end of the day because of everything that's happened. And so, I mean, they're the two kind of things that I wanted to bring in to this conversation in trying to answer that. And I know that I've just shared a lot.
No, it's good.
But that's what I get from reflecting on this, and this is what brews in my mind. So
one of the things I'm so glad you've mentioned that, because I've had this thought, but it's sort of what you've shared, Dave, just added onto that. Like when we look at the life of Jesus, one of his goals in living and dying and resurrecting is to impart new life to us. And we always think it's new life with an end goal of not sinning. But there's also the end goal of, I want you to be able to worship in a more elevated way. I've never really connected that. Like, I always think of it like he wants to help course correct Ryan's bad choices, but it makes complete sense that he wants to bring out in me a posture of worship. That's good.
And I think it's important because sometimes when we articulate the gospel, we go, the gospel is that Jesus died for my sin, right? And so I can be forgiven. Yeah. And of course that's right. That's correct. But, okay, actually, the gospel is also that Jesus rose from the dead, and that Jesus is now enthroned at the right hand of the Father. Okay, and that as we behold him in his glory, in that position, that we're transformed into his image. So I think the gospel needs to. It can't just. I mean, the cross is central,
Sure.
but the cross needs to be alongside the resurrection.
Also goes to
as
what
well.
you were saying there, Ben, like the Trinity. It's like this. There's this like forever worship that's been happening, and when you factor in what Dayne's saying, this is how we're drawn into that. As image bearers, we're being drawn into that forever worship that's existed, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So, geez, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? It's just important just to take stock every now and then, and just to catch our breath. So, why do we worship? Well, because we're all worshippers, whether we like it or not. We're all worshipping something. And our encouragement as a panel is really to say, you all ought to worship God. And the reasons were that we touched on some of the therapeutic benefits that we get from worshipping God, but of course. Part of worshipping God means that we can hear from him, we can get guidance, that we can get wisdom from him in order to live out our lives. But I think what we're also saying is, well, why should we worship God? Well, it's because we're relational beings. God is a relational Father, and that's the context as to which we ought to live our lives, to have a fulfilling life, and to live a life that we've been created to be from the beginning. That's gone horribly long during the fall, but it's a life that we're called into.
Can I just chime in with something? As we're talking about this, and we briefly touched on like how we're always worshiping and we worship things. Try taking away something let me try and take something that you worship away, and let's see what happens. We fight for the things that we worship. Even the unhealthy things, if you were to hypothetically, I'm going to take your phone away, right? I'm like, excuse me, that's my phone. Don't touch it. And why? If I'm honest, for many of us, our phones, our whatever you want, put the object there that I'm trying to take away. It has a quasi therapeutic value, and we don't want to take it because it's formed this sort of comforting role in our lives in a lowercase God kind of a way, lowercase g sort of a way. And I think God's goal is to really wean us from all of those things to a true form of worship. And that's by replicating the image of Christ in us that can worship God. So I think we have to remember that everyone who's struggling with something. When I mentioned that, maybe you knew the thing that came into your mind. You didn't have to say what it is. But I think we have to also wrestle with that tension, that we have those things that are medicating us, if we could use some of that language.
So there's all these great reasons for why we should worship, but I suppose like one of the questions that I have written down here is it significant to worship God without an expectation or a hope for something in return? So our original question was in the context of our consumeristic, individualistic world, that what's in it for me? But if we can just step out of that for a second, right? Is it significant? Is it possible? I don't know, to have this posture where we just worship with no strings attached.
Yeah, I think that's something that we need to ask God to help us with, right? Because in our consumeristic society where we're so used to just, working in this transactional mindset where, I give you money, you give me this, or I do something for you, you do something for me. The thought of just, worshipping God without the expectation of anything in return, without treating him like, in a way, a Santa Claus, where we just worship him and talk to him when we want something, is actually very anti what our culture is telling us to do, right? And the way that we operate. But I think it is possible, because I think that God will help us with doing that. And as we develop a stronger and stronger relationship with him, I think that it'll just become more and more natural to do that.
You're listening to the Worship Project podcast.
Yeah, no, I love that, Kira. Ryan and Ben, any thoughts, or has Kira summed that up pretty well?
I wonder whether there's some relationship between compartmentalizing something for worship and our expectation for getting something out. So if you think about, you prioritize going to the gym, and so you put the gym in your calendar and you go and you work out, you expect that after working out for an hour, you're going to look better or you're going to feel better or something like that. And so I wonder, if there's a trap that if we restrict worship to being something that happens on a Sabbath morning that we go to, do we kind of confirm that consumeristic idea that, okay, this is where we're going, this is the time that we're setting aside for it, now we want something out of it? Whereas the conversation that we've been having so far is this shift, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the conversation we've been having is about widening our perspective of what worship is. And I wonder if that helps us to stay clear of that trap of going, okay, so because I'm doing this, I'm going to get this. Whereas if worship becomes a way of living and a way of being, I wonder whether that helps us avoid, okay, well, this is just life. Do I expect something for just living? You know, do I expect something for brushing my teeth? Do I expect something from taking my kids to school? It's like, maybe there's a link there.
Yeah, well, Ben, look, I think what you've really tapped into there is you're tapping into the way our society has really conditioned us in this consumeristic sense, where it's this reward system, it's this marketing system that we're all to some extent a victim of. Like you said there, like, oh, we should brush our teeth with the expectation of nothing, but really, you know, the Colgate ads tell us that no, you brush your teeth so that you don't get cavities or whatever the case may be. So we live in this secular world that wants to have distance to the sacred, and there's many reasons why that's actually a good thing, right? But there's a sense in which that's maybe not a helpful way, particularly when it comes to framing the discussion around worship, because when we look at the Bible, when we look at the ancient world, there is no such thing as secular, because there's far more of an overlap. There's far more of a parallel. When you walked down the first century Rome, when you walk down first century Ephesus, when you walk down first century Jerusalem, there's, well, specifically in the pagan world, there's idols, there's shrines to Aphrodite, to Zeus, to whoever, and then there's these trade guilds that are set up that you acknowledge this deity. That, like, it's religion is part of the fabric of what we do in our everyday lives. But we miss that a little bit when it comes to our society, because we go, oh, no, worship is that thing that we do between 11 a.m. to 12, but then when we're outside of that, then we're outside of holy time, we're outside of a holy place. So therefore, we can't really be worshipping. So I suppose where I'm trying to steer this and where I want us to spend a bit of time now is just reflecting really upon this secular, spiritual, or this secular and this sacred divide that we have, and what that might mean for how we approach worship.
You know, it's, as you're talking about this, and you're describing that ancient, everything was just all pervasive. It made me think of a trip I took to Nepal. I've never been to India, but I've been to Nepal. And what I was fascinated when I went to Kathmandu was how you could see that Hinduism was soaked in everything in that city. Every other corner there was a little shrine, and maybe beyond that there was a big shrine, but you were never too far from the religious. If you were to go into shops and restaurants, you will see little shrines to gods. And there was almost this sense that, man, I just felt thick. And as a Christian, it felt very heavy on me. Yeah. I was like, wow, this is like, this culture is inextricably connected with Hinduism. Western thinkers, our culture is not set up like that. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that when we compartmentalize, it actually damages us on a psychological level. And I've not read anybody who's looked at the way we compartmentalize the sacred and the secular, but I kind of wonder if that does damage to us when we sort of treat Sabbath, sunset to sunset, now I'm going to do my thing. What does that do to us when we're sort of living, I must be holy, quote unquote, in these 24 hours? The rest of the week I can let it slide. Like, what impact does that have on us? Are we living a duplicitous lifestyle? Like, I'm just thinking aloud right here.
But go, Curly.
I think it can become, it's almost like you could get two selves, right? The one where I'm buddies with God, and the one where I'm just doing my thing and I'm living my life the way that I want to live my life, right? But that's, I think that what you're getting to, is that unhealthy? I think it's got to be, it's like you're living a double life. When, the ancients, they didn't have an idea of anything, there being any divide. When you woke up, you were with God. When you were at work, you were with God. When you're at home, you're with God. When you're sleeping, you're with God. And so maybe that's a healthier perspective to take.
And I mean, just to be super clear, we all affirm that the Sabbath day is a holy day that God's blessed, and we're not minimizing that. Yeah. I think what we're saying is, let's not minimize the Sabbath. Instead, I think what we're saying is let's just don't contain worship to Sabbath, but let it transcend, let it invade Monday to Friday, let it invade our work lives, let it and with that the case. What picture of worship are we getting? Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Ben, at all? Because I just noticed that...
Not right now. I lost my thought.
Sorry.
No.
But can I just say how cool it is, though, when you get to live your life with God? For me, something that really keeps me grounded is, I spend a lot of time driving between appointments, and so I find that when I'm with someone, I'm on. And then I'll be sitting in the car, and often the temptation is to listen to podcasts or a book or some music, and I do that. But sometimes I'm able to spend time in prayer, and especially when I've got something that I know is going to be hard, and just being able to say, hey God, thank you for being with me today, and can you help me with this next thing? And what a privilege it is to be able to do that, and to be able to know that in any moment there's no divide, because God actually cares about me, and he cares about my daily life, and he's always up for a chat, and it's not something that we have to divide up.
Has it come back to you?
It has come back.
Right.
I'm wondering, is part of the thing that drives this because we find worship hard, or we think worship is hard? Because if it's easier to bear with anything when you know there's an end date to it. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, if I have to do this hard thing, but I've only got to do it for an hour, then I can do it.
Yeah. Exercise, right?
Exercise. Yeah. I wonder if we think whether we make worship into something that's hard. And I know we talked in our last episode about what is worship, but I think we miss that God created us in a certain way. And although we've got trouble in this world, if we actually lean into the way that God created us and be those worshippers that we've talked about, maybe it wouldn't be as hard as what we think it is in our mind of going, oh, I have to worship.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think some of the items you've really touched on we'll be able to revisit in a later episode, where we're going to be exploring some of the barriers we have to worship. And maybe one of the barriers that we experience, if we're being honest with ourselves, is that we make worship something more complicated and more difficult than what it needs to be. So you've touched on something there that we are actually going to dig down on in a lot more depth in a future episode. But if I can just summarize the ground we've covered, because we're going to need to start landing our episode in just a few moments' time. But we said in episode 1 that worship is essentially this awareness of God, and it's how we respond to that awareness. All right. And this episode we've shifted and we've said, okay, well, why would I want to do that? Why do I worship? Why would I want to do that? And we're saying, well, it's because we're all wired that's how we're all wired as humans, okay, to worship something, okay? And we're saying another reason why we should do that is because when we do worship the one true God rather than these idols, we're actually getting all these benefits. One of which is this therapeutic benefit as we're reconnecting with Him, and so on and so forth. And I think what we've just touched on now is we're actually saying, well, another reason why we need to do this is because it's maybe not healthy for us to live two versions of ourselves, a secular version and a sacred version. Instead, the way for us to live holistically as humans is for these two to come together, at least in the context of this discussion around worship, and for us to not have this Sabbath hat and then this secular hat, but wear the same hat that just invades all these areas. And how empowering is that for us as believers to be able to have integrity and to be able to just function in this constant vocation and posture where we're recognizing God and we're responding, where we're recognizing and we're responding. That might be at church, but it might be at work, it might be walking the dog, it might be at the gym. But if we can get there, I think we've been able to really zoom in on this why question. But there's a scenario that we want to share with our listeners to give us a bit of a challenge maybe on what this might mean for us on a really, really practical level as we land this episode. And so, Ben, would you like to just share with us the challenge or the train of thought
Okay.
there?
So as I was thinking about why we worship, sometimes it's easy to think about we've got lots of time for that. But if we were to put ourselves in a position where we were told we only had a limited time to live, and that was for certain, that you only had this amount of time, often we think about what would we fit in that last, period of time that we've got. And so the thought that I was, and I think that those are the things that end up being our highest priorities, the things that are most dear to us. That might be creating memories with family or something like that, going to a place you've never been. But my question is, does worship hit that priority list? And I don't mean that from a perspective of assurance, like, we can talk about the assurance of salvation. I think we can have assurance of salvation. We don't need to worship to try and, I'm not talking about trying to worship to make sure that you're in the kingdom when you've died. I'm saying, hang on a minute, why would worship hit those last few months or weeks of your life? Why would you include that? Why does it hit the priority list with all the other bucket list things you might have to do?
Yeah, that's good. Kira and Ryan, I don't know if you've thought about that question before. Like, if you had 1 week to live, or if you had 1 day to live, if you had some finite time, which in a sense we all do, but if that was made perfectly clear, would your response be, oh, I'm going to worship? Like, what? That's a really interesting one. How would you unpack that one?
For me, one of the key elements in worship, there is this element of praise. And I can't help but think, I'm not sure if this is the way the question should have been answered, but it's where I'm going. I would think, I'm glad you've asked that question, because I think it'd give me time to reflect on what did God give me. As disappointing as it is that the end is coming, I could look and go, man, I've been blessed with this incredible family. I've been blessed, like, not in that, the Pharisee who prays and goes, look at me, I'm so blessed. But getting to know God and all of the things He's done for me and reflecting on that, I can't help but think that would be a really valuable exercise to sit in that place and just see what He's done over the course of a life. So for me, worship is very much an element of praise and thanksgiving. I would need to sit a little bit longer in this question to give a deeper answer than that, but that's something that comes initially to my mind, just that posture of being thankful.
Yeah, I think for me, it would become even more important, right? And I love that, developing a posture of praise and being thankful. But I think also being able to, if someone told me I was going to die in a year, I'd get a little bit worried, to be honest, what's going on. And being able to hand that on over to God and to lean on Him, to cast my worries and stresses on Him and to continue to worship through that is fantastic. And I've heard of stories before of people who've said, about, normally it's about elderly people who are close to passing away, that they are just so close to God that when they get to heaven, they're not going to know the difference. And I think that's such a goal to have, just to be so close to God that, you know, after you die, the next thing you know is Jesus coming back in heaven, and just to be in such a close relationship with him that you're like, this is natural, this is the next step.
I mean, Ben, there's a temptation, like the question is, would you worship if you knew you had one day to live, right? There's a temptation to respond to that question of going, or thinking, as you're thinking through that question, there's a temptation to go, would I put on music and sing hymns? Would I put on music and listen? Or would I pray? But this is sort of what we're trying to move away from, right?
Yeah.
Because we're just saying that, well, worship is that, but worship's actually so much more than that, right? Yeah. So would I want to, if I knew I had a day to live, just turn on my worship playlist and just sit in the car and worship?
Yeah.
If I'm honest, no, I don't think I would do that. But that doesn't mean to say that whatever I do end up doing wouldn't be worship.
That's right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Because when I look at this question in Scripture, in John 13, the Bible tells us Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world. In other words, Jesus knows he's got 1 hour left to live.
Yeah.
Okay? And I'm convinced that Jesus lived his whole life in constant worship. Okay? So what does Jesus do as an act of worship, knowing that he has 1 hour left to live? Well, we continue to read that Jesus got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet. I would say Jesus' last hour, he prioritized worship. And what did that look like? It wasn't going to the temple and offering a sacrifice.
Yeah.
What did that look like? It looked like washing his disciples' feet.
Come on.
So what would, as an act of worship, what do we do? Maybe it looks like visiting our family. Maybe it looks like visiting, whatever it is. And the point of what we're saying, team, in this whole podcast is we need to move away from worship being this to this holistic posture, this inward disposition. And I would love to think that I would model my life in my last hour after Jesus, but that's what Jesus did, and that's how Jesus worshipped. And I think that's incredible. And if that doesn't inspire us to go out there, then I don't know what will.
So I'm about to live. I'm going to serve you and wash your feet. Oh, yeah.
So, everyone, look, thank you so much for joining episode 2 of our podcast series, Why Worship? We're going to join you again in our next episode, where we're going to be looking specifically at the differences between corporate worship and personal worship. So it's going to probably get it's going to get quite practical, I think. And we're looking forward to having you join us then. So thank you for tuning in for now, and God bless you as you go about the rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to the Worship Project podcast. Subscribe to the show on all good podcast platforms. Find us, follow us, and let us know what you think about today's show at the Worship Project Australia on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Discover more at theworshipproject.com.au.